Hello, everybody. Welcome to We're Getting Canceled, the live episode 1 here. We are going to be talking about a few things today. Maybe if we get time, we'll see how far we get. We'll be talking about perhaps some of the tech cancel culture battles that are looming. We've seen stuff with Coinbase, Basecamp, the author of Chaos Monkeys, and some Apple stuff as well. Strange Bedfellows and Bill C-10 in Canada. When Liberals and Separatists find common cause in regulating the internet, because internet regulation is always a fun topic of discussion. And then we'll maybe get a little bit into the mass droplets, aerosols, and all that sort of stuff that's going on. And, maybe we'll talk about who's injecting bleach or not. And that will probably get us canceled right then and there. So I have a guest with me today, Chris Chapman. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit so everyone knows who to cancel?
Well, thank you, Todd. You didn't introduce yourself, so I'll introduce you.
Oh, all right.
Todd Sharon, everyone. Todd's graciously invited me to participate in this first episode of his podcast. So I am a native Torontonian since 1995, but actually I hailed before that from the wilds of northwestern Ontario. I grew up in a small village at the top of Lake Superior called Thunder Bay. Maybe you might have heard of it. So what brings me to this podcast is that Todd and I share, even though we philosophically, politically sometimes converge and diverge, like our Venn diagrams kind of overlap with each other, we have some very interesting perspectives, I think, on common topics. And so Todd and I have been carrying on a conversation, I think, for the better part of 2 years privately. And this brings us to sharing those concepts and ideas with you today. And we think that they're sufficient enough that this could be our last episode.
That is the general idea. I mean, I have no idea right now if we're actually live or not. I mean, StreamYard says we're live, so we're going to go with that. I'm trying to find it on the YouTube thing. So technical things, always fun in your first episode. So yeah, this happened a little while ago. We can talk about this a little bit. The whole Coinbase stuff, Basecamp, Chaos Monkeys, and Apple. And I think it starts with Coinbase, actually. I think Coinbase was on the first put out a statement saying basically, leave your politics at home, which did not sit well with a lot of the employees and was leaked out. I don't know if they published it or if it leaked out. I don't know if you remember that. And that caused a bit of a stir, and that was quickly followed by Basecamp doing likewise and having a whole bunch of employees leave, getting very generous packages. So maybe let's start with those two. So what are your thoughts on where that's coming from? Kind of a little bit out of nowhere, maybe a little bit not, but we hadn't seen anything like that. And suddenly now we have at least 2 companies starting, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe some other companies that have been joining in.
Well, yeah, with respect to Coinbase, I'm not as familiar as I am with what's gone on with Basecamp, but the overall thread is a surprising one that's emerged, which is something that we wouldn't have expected, because basically what we're talking about is virtue signaling within the corporate environments, right? So you buy yourself some credibility with some people who are looking to curry favor in terms of how your organization is managed. And I think what we begin to see is this idea of the inmates running the asylum. Companies no longer have this direction or purpose where their aim is to please their customers and make things for their customers or make their customers' lives easier. Now it's taking on shades, if you will, of having to adopt certain politically correct stances. So what is happening within a lot of companies right now, where they're actually finding that by indulging some of these ideas, it started very simply. And I remember this starting 15 years ago almost with corporate social responsibility, CSR. And who could be against corporate social responsibility? CSR was like, you want to be a good corporate citizen, don't you? You want to plant a tree, you want to sweep a sidewalk, you want to maybe take ownership of a chunk of highway. I mean, there were a lot of laudable programs. But even back then, I remember having discussions with colleagues saying, well, but where does the actual aim or purpose of the organization fit in? What do we do? These are all great ancillary things to do, but how do we get to do them if we're not pleasing customers? If this becomes our primary goal, now we're no longer a company. We're actually doing something very different. So what I'm seeing happening with with Coinbase and companies like Basecamp, where the level of toxicity of the political discussion has actually gotten to a point where even the company owners can no longer tolerate it, and it's beginning to seep into dividing the ranks within the organization. Like, this is pretty interesting development, and that it's happening right now is really quite, I think, revealing and critical. This is a critical point.
And I think one of the interesting things that's happening is I think people forget, why businesses are in business, right?
Mm.
And I'm actually probably going to make a separate video on this. This is more kind of on, the coaching consulting side of things that you and I do. And I think people misunderstand this idea. So when we think about a business exists for a purpose. And I'm going to put you on the spot here for this one. And it's a little bit of a trick question because the answer is more obvious, but it's uncommon that I'm looking for here. So, like, what is the purpose of a business? Why does a business exist?
Well, it depends on the organization, but I would say its aim is through its products and services to create jobs ongoing into the future.
So very timing of you.
Yeah.
But I'm actually going to disagree with you on there.
Okay.
I think every business has the same purpose, and it's much simpler than that.
Make money.
And that is to stay in business.
Yeah. Well, how do you create jobs if you don't stay in business, right?
Exactly.
You've got to make something people want.
And this is interesting. Like I say this, and it's not just to oversimplify things, though, because this is actually, it explains a lot. If you understand this basic concept that every business exists to stay in business, to kind of self-perpetuate itself, this actually explains why you see different corporate behaviors as companies grow. Like, why do startups, why are they more attentive to their customers? Because if they don't, they go out of business. Why is Google or Twitter not attentive to their customers? Because if they lose a customer, they don't go out of business. They have other things, other ways of staying in business.
Yep.
So, as long as you're finding ways to make sure that you perpetuate your company, that you continue to stay in business, continue to make money, and that results sometimes in jobs, you'll find different tactics. And the tactics aren't always, just putting out a quality product. You'd like to think that. But when you're a startup, you got to listen to your customers. You got to, if a customer complains, you're going to bend over backwards to satisfy that customer. Whereas once you reach a certain size, if a customer is giving you too much trouble, you'll just say, hit the bricks, pal. I don't care. I don't need your business. And that's going to keep your company going. And both of those have benefits. But it's, what are we in the business to do? Well, we're in the business of staying in business. And I think one of the challenges is, as we've seen now, every business is getting into the social justice business. And that's very weird, because I don't know if that's a way you stay in business. And just to reference one of the recent ones, it's a non-tech one. But just recently, going viral today, was this National Geographic project about racism. Which, again, maybe you think it's great to have projects about racism, but is that what National Geographic is about? Because I don't remember National Geographic being about that. But now they're about that. And now sports are about that. And now tech companies are about that.
Well, what I don't know if you caught kind of the ancillary tidbits, or the contextual tidbits that went around the Nat Geo kerfuffle with that. They've been enjoying declining sales and profits for a very, very long time. And what I see happening right now, there's often a good way in retail to tell whether your favorite store is going to go out of business soon, and it's when they start stocking tchotchkes. So, for example, at Best Buy, if you start seeing board games and you start seeing, blankets and throws and all of these things that are not the core business of what you expect an electronics, department store, if you will, to be retailing, then you know that the mindset of management is, we have to get people in the store. And maybe if we get them in with these tchotchkes and these lower priced items, they might be interested in a larger priced item like a TV. But of course, it's just the circling of the drain. So what I see with what Nat Geo is doing is they're desperately trying to buy themselves some eyeballs to come over. Not like, they don't have a centuries long tradition of exploration, photography, and stellar journalism to back themselves up with. Now they've got to go scraping at this level. I think I may be out on a limb here, but I think that everyone is seeing this for what it is, whether you agree or disagree with their particular perspective.
No, that's interesting, because can be a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. This kind of goes back to the cliche saying of get woke, go broke. Is it get woke, go broke, or go broke, get woke? Well, it's interesting because it may actually be both in some cases, right? So in this case, if they're having dwindling sales, then maybe this draws attention to them that they didn't get before, and maybe that perpetuates, again, the purpose of the business is to stay in business, and maybe that floats them along for a few months, few years more, maybe. But it also comes the other way too, in that you get a lot of internal advocacy that drives a lot of this to make the business focus about these things. And that's kind of what we saw with what kind of has been happening recently with Apple. Where it's kind of been driven internally. It's not because Apple's having problems with business or customers, but the people who work there are very passionate about these causes. And, rather than doing them in their spare time, they want to do them on their work time. And they want their company to represent their, whether it be political beliefs or social beliefs about, how to make the world a better place. But they think their work should be about that too. Where it used to be kind of your work is your job, and whatever you care for and advocate for, you go and do that in non-work hours. Now it's, I want to actually form a committee. And I think this is what happened at Basecamp as well. They had the committees and they said, no more committees, because, people want to self-organize in organizations to make the world a better place, make the workplace a better place. But then that ends up being the focus, and you're not focused on the products and services to your customers. And now, again, your business becomes about this other thing. And then again, whether that's good because you're trying to drive attention to yourself so that you can not go broke, or that it takes away from your main business. And as a result of this getting woke, you end up going broke. And it's not even, because I don't even want to it's not even about the particular causes. It's about any cause. So, whether you're, politically right, left, or whatever, is this what your business should really be about? Or is your business about, how do you stay in business in the products and services that you decided to provide?
And and this is why I think, these organizations that are having this reaction to keeping politics out of the workplace is so critical at this point, because when it began, like the dominoes started toppling, right? So over the past couple of years, we've just seen one company, even companies, smaller companies that you and I have worked with or have seen or know of, they all begin to adopt very, very similar patterns and stances, begin to hire diversity officers and chief happiness officers and all of these things. But now to see, I didn't expect this at all. Like, this is rather remarkable, the speed with which the shift has come. And it's not come from smaller players, it's come from bigger players. And this is a real, it's kind of an indication that the schism is significant and could have some lasting play to it, right? Because now you're going to see people look at, well, if they did it, if they're starting to do this and they're weathering the attrition as people leave because they believe they can no longer identify with the people who sign their paychecks, that's going to have a very interesting effect. I'm very interested in what happens next year.
So I would disagree slightly on that. I don't think that these are necessarily big players. I think Apple's the only real big player who's come in. I mean, if you look at Basecamp, they're a fairly small company, although they revenue-wise are doing well for their size. And same with Coinbase with their IPO, but they're fairly small as number of employees. And I think that's particularly why you see that stuff there, is because they know, you only have so many people in your company. You can't spend so much time. If you have, we've got your happiness officer, your diversity officer, and they've got the people that report to them, and they've got to run sessions and workshops and all this stuff. And that's all taking away from your core focus. And if you're a company with maybe less than 300 employees, I think both of them are under 300, then it's like, well, that's a pretty significant chunk of your workforce that's not actually focused on your mission. But I do agree that Apple was the one that kind of stepped up, and that's I'm curious what drove that. I mean, I think it was just kind of one after the other. I think just it became a little bit too much. I don't know.
So I'll just I agree with the point that you're making. Like, in terms of the head count, yeah, they're not that large. It's more, what is their market capitalization and influence? And so some of these are, they cast big wakes, and they're definitely polarizing in an interesting way. I don't know, like, polarizing suggests that people are splitting evenly. I don't think that's happening whatsoever. I don't think we fully know the implications of this just yet. So it's going to be interesting to see, okay, well, now that these guys have said that, this toxic stuff that's ripping us apart internally is dividing us more and more and distracting from our core mission, is that going to be replicated? Certainly, we don't see that amongst the more conservative, large headcount organizations like banks and insurance companies, government. I think government is starting to go in, predictably, they're, kind of the late leapers across the chasm, and they're predictably going to be in a very long drain spin for a while.
Well, and I think in those companies that you can kind of, and again, this is the side effect of the size and the bureaucracy in the organization, is that there is time to be had, there is money to be had for programs you can advocate for, regardless of whether they have an impact or not. It doesn't matter. You can kind of float those things for years, and then you won't necessarily notice a huge shift. Whereas, again, something like a base camp, whereas if you're distracted from your focus with such a small employee base, you're going to see that, in your bottom line fairly quickly.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's, one of the things that they recognize. And it's not even so much whether internally it, polarizes and you have infighting, which obviously we've seen some of those things flare up. But it is just generally that distraction. Because one thing, and I think we talked about this before, that I've noticed recently is like, we had waves of innovation, particularly technological innovation, social media companies, all this sort of stuff for years. And everyone was talking about how the pace of change is accelerating. Things are going really quickly. And yet it's been a long time since something significant has happened.
Yeah.
Like, if you think tech-wise, we had, the Apple iPhone, and then we had smartphones, and there was chaos there for a little bit as they started to mature. But your Android phone doesn't change that much now. Your iOS doesn't change all that much. Nothing really new and innovative there. Your social networks, Facebook's still dragging along, although they're losing, I guess, I wouldn't say users, but their active users is not quite the activity they used to have.
Mm-hmm.
You still have Instagram. I mean, maybe TikTok is the newest, and that's, perhaps tied into the Chinese government in some ways. I mean, this is not like coming out of some Silicon Valley tech hub of innovation. So, like, where is it all going? And isn't perhaps because of the distraction and the focus that everybody's just been focused on politics for the last 4 or 5 years, that it's like, even you think like Uber and Lyft and things like that, Airbnb, the food delivery companies, which again got a boost during the pandemic, but at the same time, they existed years ago. None of these are brand new.
That's true. Yeah. No, I would agree on all of these points. I think what you're pointing out is very, very, very salient. The question is now, what's next? What is going to, like we think that we're perceiving a particular tipping point. So this distraction is now reaching a point where it must be affecting significantly. And I think we've probably seen a little bit of this, like with the backlash against the NBA, some sporting franchises, where the customers are not exactly happy with having politics saturate their product, and they want to get that back out again. And so now we're seeing this kind of knock-on effect. So it's horrible to say that this is now affecting the bottom line. It should never have gotten to the point where it was affecting the bottom line, but it's obvious that it is. Otherwise, these motivations wouldn't be happening, because even amongst the most progressive corporate leadership, there is a realization, and I think Russ Akoff used to say this, that the station that basically all of upper management is directed around behaviors that allow them to sustain their standard of living. And so when that begins to get pressed upon, it's a rather sarcastic and cynical way to look at it, but I think Akoff was onto something, is going to be something around the lines of, we've got to cut this out, guys. This is now beginning to dig into happy fun time for all of us, and that's not going to last. So I'm very curious as to when we see how these balance sheets are playing out, because, well, just on a broad sense, I mean, it's tangential. It's tangential, but this whole program is about running on tangents. I just read something within the last week or so about the CEO of Gillette saying that their campaign, their woke campaign, which cost them $8 billion, he was happy with.
Oh yeah. Well,
it didn't.
You have to remember, like, it was applauded by certain people.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
they got a lot of positive press off of that. They got a lot of negative press off of that too.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, okay, did that attention, because sometimes negative attention is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we were talking about like the National Geographic stuff, hey, declining subscriptions and attention, maybe, any attention is good attention.
Yeah.
So, what was you have to wonder, what was their objective when they ran the campaign? Was it just to, sell more razor blades, or, did they just want to get the attention? Because if they went, and said, hey, to the board, we just want to get some attention here to our brand, remind people that we're here, maybe that's a success, right? Look at all the attention we got.
Well, yeah, and in past times, in before times, if you lost $8 billion doing that kind of exposition, you'd be kindly shown the door. I mean, like we are now in different times, so this kind of undercuts my argument a little bit with the Gillette case. But I brought it up to show that there is a contrapoint to be made here. But I think in some of the other organizations, it's not just they're seeing the friction, because quite honestly, no attention, significant or useful attention, let's say, inside of most large organizations is paid to how well do we all get along. In fact, it's completely the opposite. It's Lord of the Flies. Like, that's basic management. So, the fact that people are having internecine political wars with each other about, which pet causes they endorse or which worldview or philosophy they want to support, I don't think that ever entered into it. I'm cynical enough to say that it began to show up in worse productivity between the teams, which translated into worse sales. And it may have only been a couple of percentage points, but it was enough. And then that was it.
Well, that's the thing too, and this is kind of the bigger company versus smaller company, which is why we may see stuff like this in Basecamp that we don't see in Gillette or in a Nike or a Coca-Cola. Is, again, they can screw up for decades.
Yeah.
And they will still fulfill the purpose of business, which to stay in business, because they will still stay in business.
People are going to keep buying razor blades.
That's right. And they're still going to be maybe the cheapest one there. They're going to be the easiest one, the most recognizable name. So even though they might lose some, but if they still manage to stay in business, then they've succeeded, right? And now they can say, hey, not only did we stay in business, but we did social good. So, we took a hit, but that's okay, because, it shows how much virtue we have as a company, right? We can virtue signal, and then they can say, well, we're putting that into the long-term bank, because we're banking all our goodwill that we will eventually, we'll tell our investors, eventually this is going to come back. People are going to remember that we were on the right side of history on this. Because again, if it's not just whether you lose money. It's like, okay, well, you didn't have as profitable a quarter or whatever. But for these really big companies, they can go a long time being not very profitable and still be fine. And they will still make enough to make money, or they'll probably still even be profitable, just not as profitable.
Yep.
And so it's like, well, they can get away with it. I'll bring in an example for a company I worked for, and they were not by any stretch a large company. They did eventually go out of business. But their success was they found the right product in the right place at the right time. And they were very successful with it. And there were good times and there were bad times. They went through the dot-com bubble bust, and that was rough times. But this product was still, their product. They put it in the market. They got their customers. And they just were so reliant on that no matter what happened, they just say, well, we're just going to fix up our product. Our product's going to turn it around. We'll improve our product. We'll rewrite our product. They did like 5 rewrites of the product. And yet somehow the business kept slowly and slowly and slowly going out of business until eventually it went completely out of business. Never at any point did they say, maybe there's not a market for our product anymore. Maybe things have changed in the world and we need a new and different product, or we need to find a better way to satisfy our customers' needs, or we need to find new customers. That was never an occurrence, because it was just like, this is the thing that always made us money. This is the thing that will always make us money. It worked before, it's going to keep working. And it's the same sort of thing that I think, when you see with these companies, is like they can keep doing this because, hey, as long as we're still going in business, we're still winning, right? So, because Coca-Cola can make all these missteps, and it's not even just like to one political side or the other, because Pepsi had their handing out the Pepsi to the police campaign that went sideways. So it doesn't really matter like what your politics are on it. It's like, but they can do this sort of stuff, screw it up, and still, guess what? 10 years from now, they're not going to remember. But guess what? 10 years from now, Coca-Cola is still going to be around. Gillette's still going to be around. And people will have forgotten about it. and it doesn't matter. Only if they really keep screwing up continuously will they ever actually have any consequences.
Yeah, when you bring up this, it reminds me, I've just been rewatching some very old episodes of Futurama. And there was the episode they had, I don't know if you're familiar with the series that Matt Groening did, but he had an episode which basically poked fun at Willy Wonka and the chocolate factory and Coca-Cola. And just, and the product is called Slurm. And then they find out it comes out of a disgusting worm. And the main character, Fry, even when he finds that out, it's so addictive, he can't stop drinking it. I think you're right. I think that, we've got our Slurm in a number of different categories, and people are not about to give that up. They'll take a stand, they'll take a principled stand to a point, but if that product has become so integrated into their identity or lifestyle or refrigerator, that's not about to disappear. I think sugar water and razor blades are probably a good business to be in.
Yeah, and I think there's often a kind of more politically right or conservative kind of idea that, well, this will all go away when it starts hurting the bottom line. And again, when you look at these large companies that are in, I don't know that that's the case. I mean, again, maybe you see it on these smaller companies because they just can't afford to do it. But we could have decades of this going on, and there are people working at these companies that are going to be saying, well, I want to be doing my job working on this thing, but instead I'm got to go to this session, this committee, this training thing.
Well, but they backtrack. Coke did backtrack. Let's go on another tangent. They did backtrack on their critical race theory training. So it's something.
I mean, they took the training down from LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And they may not use that particular training deck, but I didn't see any indication that they were going to stop doing that.
Maybe. I was some of the things that I was reading, it seemed to give the impression, and of course, how can we know what's going on inside internally in the organization until the next document leak comes out? But I think they've got to be aware that when they proceed with this, if they've had one leak, they will have more. So if we see one data point, yes, does not necessarily connote a trend. You're right. So we've got to see a few more data points to be able to establish that. But I think it was interesting enough that it embarrassed them because it did get out publicly, and then they reacted to that. Like if they were proud of what they were doing, they might have just left it up on LinkedIn and said, this is the way Coca-Cola is going to work from now.
Well, I think you see what you see often in organizations. Like if you think that, they're embarrassed by that leak, that their response is going to be not to do the embarrassing thing. I think 9 times out of 10, instead what you see is a company try to track down on stopping leaks rather than change the behavior.
Yeah.
At least that's historically what I've seen in organizations is,
that's fair.
It may be obvious to say, well, just don't do the embarrassing thing, but it's actually more likely they'll just say, well, how do we stop this from getting out? And again, I don't even know, when it comes out, when they get embarrassed like that, it's like, I don't think they necessarily knew what was in those trainings.
Oh, no.
Because to a certain point, they're just like, again, it's just, hey, we're being told this is a good thing. Our employees tell us they want this sort of stuff. So here's a company that says they do it. They seem to have a decent reputation. We'll bring them in and do it. And they don't go through the material. They don't go through all the training stuff. I mean, you and I have done training. It's very rare for a company to say, oh, I want to go through your training material ahead of time. It has happened to me before, but it's not very frequent. So, I think they were probably surprised as anyone else, at least certain people who didn't go through it with what they saw. But even so, again, I don't see them walking back from the general idea of doing it, because again, it's not really unpopular. That's the strange thing, right? I mean, it's unpopular with some people.
Well, yeah, potentially, right? And I don't think we actually have a good barometer on where that divide is coming from, because a lot of our opinions are shaped by very vocal, smaller groups that are creating the impression that the support for this particular idea is widespread. And then you read, as you read more and more, and you begin to stitch together how the actual employee feels, you get these stories where they're privately admitting, but they're afraid to say anything, because if they do, which is much like the topic of this entire podcast, they're afraid they're going to get canceled. They're never going to work again. They have a mortgage, they have a car, they've got 2 kids. I mean, they can't afford to say anything against this. So the support is pretty conditional, soft. But what would be a very interesting thing to, from an academic perspective, is to explore. I don't know if you actually could ever know this, is how that is actually flowing, what the actual support level is, what the real opinions of people are, because it's a very divisive philosophy, and it's designed to pin people into corners very quickly and separate the wheat from the chaff very, very quickly.
And now, again, we haven't seen every training that goes on. Maybe there's some that are really good. I don't know. Obviously, we get the ones that leak out that are obviously more
That's the only ones we see.
Yeah, of course. But here's the thing that I'd like to know is, this has been happening for quite some time now, these trainings. Are we actually seeing the results from them that we would expect? And how would we know if we were seeing results from them? So companies are spending lots and lots of money and lots of time. Same sort of thing. Again, those smaller organizations focusing on these things. This is not a free endeavor, right? It pulls you away from your business. It costs you a lot of money. And some of these people charge a lot of money, way more than I charge. And I like to think that my prices are fairly high. But no, they'll charge way more than even I charge for stuff. And yet, I don't know that anyone has really been able to point to, like, which company came out of nowhere that got this type of training and suddenly look at them, they're gangbusters. I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's the role of a good consultant, I guess, or a good consulting company. I asked this of one of my customers a long time ago. I said, what do you think the aim of a consulting company or a consultant is? And he said, well, it's to help me solve my problems. Yeah, but actually the real aim is to expand their footprint inside your organization so that you need them more and more. So if they are able to find a hook that suddenly gets them through most of your defenses, and in the old days it used to be getting past the assistants to the executives so that you could get access to the directors or the VPs who had access to the funds so that you could get buy-in. Those days are kind of gone. Now there are buckets of money that are allocated for specific training initiatives, and baked into the objectives that you will find in most large corporations, they'll say, we are making a commitment to invest so much in diversity hires and training. So you'll find that those buckets of money, they all get apportioned down and divested and divvied up. And eventually you can even find parts of that being offered through a senior level manager who reports to a lower level director. And then thus it goes in. But yeah, I could see that this was a bonanza. And I think in the United States, the opportunity is it's much more lucrative to be pursuing that kind of consulting right now. I think probably it's going to end up in Canada very shortly. The bonanza is going to come. So if you're prepared, if you've got in your back pocket CRT training, and you got some workshops that you can put people through, man, you're going to make a killing.
I'm sure it's already happening. I mean, I've seen documents from the Canadian government, so they're already hiring people doing this sort of stuff.
Yeah, good consultants would be all over this, all over.
And so, one of the things that's interesting about it is how does something like this come about to be such a phenomenon? And not just, I don't mean social phenomenon. I mean in the workplace. Like, is this really just like companies just have way too much money? Like, is this like you have so much disposable income, you have so few problems that this is just like, hey, we've got money for it, let's spend it. Because again, in let's say post .com bubble burst, you would not see this happening because there was no money, there was no budget, and pre-pandemic, you had a roaring economy, all these businesses were doing very well, and suddenly money is not an issue.
Well, I think you've got something there, but that's where the reckoning is going to come. So a lot of the large corporations, they've got still reserves of capital, large reserves. And I'm actually surprised. I've talked with some of my friends who are quite well connected with people in finance and people in government. And they're telling me the sums of money that are available on tap for corporations and for investors to access is just incredible. It's pent up. My original thinking on this was the pandemic would have caused a lot more havoc and made the bottom line much more tenuous to hold on to. And so we would see a retreat from some of these programs, because generally this is the kind of stuff you invest in when times are good, when the fat is there. But the countervailing pressure that I see that could be coming, and especially here in Canada, ties around the level of indebtedness that we have. And it's at levels that far exceed our counterparts in the G7 or the G20. And it's a precarious Jenga tower. I mean, we could come out of it, possibly, but the effect that it's going to have on balance sheets for corporate investment and for taxation, which could be coming, because we're just seeing the beginnings of increasing inflation that's going to begin to play out. And once that just starts going, it's a ripple effect. It'll take over a lot of things. And then you're going to see that's when the retraction is going to come, and that's when these programs and these consultants are going to find themselves on the outs. But that I don't see happening immediately. We're in this weird, very quiescent period that you're not certain if it's going to last or if this is what happens before the tsunami hits. The table is set financially. Canada's finances are terrible. Our taxation policies are terrible. We have placed ourselves at an incredible disadvantage to our competitors nationally, with respect to the United States, with respect to Europe, with respect to the Pacific Rim, how deeply tied in we are with China. It's hard not to see our economy, and therefore a lot of these larger organizations, taking a hit. When they take a hit, you're going to see those programs suddenly become luxuries.
This is one of those interesting things that kind of happened. I don't know that anyone really saw this coming in the pandemic, was because everything shut down, because there's not a lot of stuff you can do, and because there are government programs providing funds to people who can't work, you have people with money, but nowhere to put it. And so I kind of mentioned this in my previous video where I was talking about the GameStop and AMC stuff.
Right.
And I think we see this on a corporate level as well. Again, you can invest in all kinds of stuff because there's really nothing else you can do. You're not, and if you're an individual, we've seen, interest rates are so low, you're not going to get a savings account. The stock market's fairly flat, although it did boom for a little bit there. So you can play some stocks, but I mean, just general investment funds or bonds, you're not really getting any return. So, and real estate prices are obviously in Canada going through the roof. So, because now they've got some of that money, nowhere to put it, buy some real estate goes up. So now you see more chaotic stuff, people buying cryptocurrencies, people buying stocks, GameStop, AMC, because people want to make money on their money. That's the whole point. We're told to invest and save and grow for your retirement, but the avenues to do that are basically gone. So people are trying to find new ways. So it's weird because we get this weird kind of unusual spending behaviors, and I'm curious what's going to happen after some of the restrictions are lifting. For anyone watching who doesn't know, we are both in Ontario in Canada right now, which is still locked down here in June 2021.
196 days and counting. Yeah,
I at least got out for a little bit to a semi-non-lockdown place for a little while, and then they immediately locked down about a few weeks after I moved here. So I got a small respite from the lockdown, but still can't get a haircut, as you can tell. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you think is happening with some of the money spending, whether it be corporate spending or personal spending, as a result of what's been going on?
Well, I think that to latch on to what I was just saying earlier, those who have got the capital and have been able to weather it, they're looking. So what have we seen? The housing market here in Toronto is super hot still. You would have expected that to have fallen right through the bottom. And I just read a news article today where a millennial scribe was bemoaning the fact, well, I don't think she's a scribe, I think she was invited to write. She says she's got a great job, good income, and the best that she can hope to afford is a locker under current prices. And it's like, yeah, but this is not a new phenomenon. Toronto has been escaping the ability of even well-placed upper middle-class earners to be able to afford anything. I mean, I live in Midtown, and within 10 years, semis, which were going for, which I thought was ridiculous, between 400 and 500,000, are now, approaching 2 million. They're probably 1.5, 1.75, somewhere in that neighborhood. Just ridiculous. Townhomes with no view that look into each other. $1.2 million, $1.3 million a piece. So we're beginning to see this rapid asset inflation that is occurring, and it's going to make it's basically making the the real estate market affordable only for certain folks, which is squeezing out the ability for the rest of the earners in the economy, which support everything, to be able to live and work here. They're now going to be either leaving or going to be commuting. So that's one aspect. But I go back to what some of my friends have been telling me. When we start getting into the folks who have 1 million plus disposable income, some of them operate hedge funds managing tens of millions of dollars and have been basically just weathering, just in a stable holding pattern, making sure that their clients are still being looked after, and they're getting a good cut for it. The folks that are at that particular level, they are buying things very, very rapidly. So you're seeing, for example, within the Muskokas, you go up Highway 400 into cottage country. Cottage homes are being snapped up. The expanding, so it used to be around Parry Sound, where you're talking, about 2 hours, 2.5 hours north of Toronto a drive. It's now pushing beyond that. That used to be the top boundary of where you were getting a summer home. Now people are beginning to go even further to where my in-laws have a place up on the French River. And that used to be the boondocks. Now you're finding very well-heeled folks are coming in and snapping up property, snapping up, kind of run-down places to build them up and build new places, build a new cottage, and huge $700,000 places. So the capital is there. There seems to be no shortage of money in VCs. Startups are still doing very well here in Toronto.
One of the weird things
it's strange
about Toronto and the pandemic particularly is I know so many people, including myself, that left the city because during lockdown financially it just didn't make sense. The cost of everything up there. And you get all these people leaving, and yet prices keep going up. And it's not like there's huge influx of people coming in. It's not even like you have, because Toronto is one of the huge destination for new immigrants to move to, but the border's been closed, so you don't even have a lot of that right now. So you don't have a lot of that. You don't have a lot of new people moving to the city. We have more people moving out of the city, and yet prices still keep going up and up and up. That just seems weird to me.
Yeah, it is very strange. I listened to a talk. Well, it wasn't a talk. It was a member of parliament who was speaking on a debate, and it was with respect to a finance committee appropriations bill, something. And he was laying out basically some of the things that he was seeing as the preconditions for a potential debt crisis. And one of the harbingers, he laid out 3 or 4 things that were harbingers for a debt crisis to take hold, and Canada ticks the box for all of them. But one of the ones was very rapid asset inflation, alongside high levels of corporate household and government debt. So you add those things, high levels of debt, like not just, we're a few bucks over, but our indebtedness is per capita is beyond like we are in Canada. We're so far beyond our counterparts in the G7 or the G20. And so when you have some of these pieces in place, the rapid asset inflation, people are overextended. Now you've got the table set for potentially, and you see this discussion coming up, are we going to print money to get out of this, or are we going to raise interest rates? And it's volatile, because either solution is enough to set a cascade of things in motion that we may not be able to stop. And then, it's going to work out really well for the folks who have a lot of money, because they will be able to get out of this. The folks like you and me are not going to do so well. We're gonna bear the brunt of this. So will our kids.
Yeah, because when you think about like higher interest rates or inflation, like who does that affect the most? Well, it's not the rich people that get hurt by that one, right? Because they'll still have the most amount of money, even with inflation comes in, so they can handle any of that. And interest rates, well, hey, they can make money off interest rates, no problem. Meanwhile, everyone else is paying higher interest rates on their debt. So I want to touch briefly before we wrap up. And it looks like we're not going to hit every topic, but I wanted to touch on Bill C-10. So for those of you who aren't Canadian, who don't know what's going on, there's a bill in Canada called C-10, and it falls into the category, and this is always the way internet regulation comes in Canada. I don't know if you've been following this for years, but I have. This has been something that comes up every few years from every political party, and it's never a good thing. But it always comes from one of two places. One is we must regulate the internet in order to get more Canadian content, or we must regulate the internet to protect intellectual property rights holders from piracy. And it usually ends up being this really draconian, free speech stifling, completely stopping independent creators. All those negative side effects are always there, and they always pretend they're not, and then they always are. Now, what's crazy about this one is I have seen this come from the Liberals before, which is kind of a center-left party in Canada, if you're not that familiar. And I've seen it come from Conservatives before, so I don't trust either of the parties, and that's, of course, the more right-wing party in Canada. But what surprised me is usually, historically, the NDP has been fairly good on this. They've usually fought against each one of these. Particularly, I remember Charlie Angus did a very good job fighting against some of the previous ones. But even on this one, they're kind of falling in line, and that's really disturbing to me. Though this time the Conservatives are actually stepping up against it, which is weird because they're usually quite for this. So maybe tell us a little bit about this particular bill and what's kind of worrying about it.
Well, so with this particular bill, C-10, it's introduced by I think he's the Heritage Minister, Guilbeault.
Yeah.
So he has presented this. And it's kind of funny because generally speaking, so I have some experience in my 20s working as an assistant to members of provincial parliament. And my wife has worked for cabinet ministers. So I have a little bit of an understanding of how bills get drafted and how prepared a minister has to be. And basically what you can see this as is when a minister drafts legislation this significant, it's a way for him to make his bones. It's a way for him, like, if he handles this well, good things can come. And if he doesn't handle this well, bad things will come. But with this particular government, none of these things really seem to matter. The minister has actually presented this bill, and basically what it is designed to do is expand the regulatory powers of the CRTC, basically the regulatory body for that governs how frequency spectrums are allocated and sold within Canada, what is considered, basically radio frequency, telephony. They have a wide reach, but they've never actually,
equivalent of the FCC in the US.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah, but they've never actually had their expanded powers going into the sphere of regulating content on the internet. So that has been something that has been left untouched. And when you think that we've, from 1995 to the present, we haven't touched that, that's rather remarkable, right? There's been rumors of a Netflix tax, so there was a little bit of let's play ball. I think that happened in 2015, 2016. That was a way for them to flex. But anyway, what Guilbeault wanted to do was expand the regulatory powers so that we could control, or they could control, what would see the light of day on the internet. Not only do that, but provide the government with a kill switch for anything that didn't meet certain standards for them. And that becomes rather interesting because when he was asked to explain, well, how would this actually play out in practice? Would this affect, for example, YouTubers or TikTokers who may be putting something up on a platform like Rumble or YouTube? Are you saying that this would apply? Because his original intent, as he said, was, well, I just want to make it easy for Canadians to find Canadian content.
And there was a user exception that was in the original draft of the bill.
Precisely, yeah. And then that was taken away. Then they brought it back again, and it's been debated in committee. And I think it's getting the kibosh once again. But interesting point on that.
Just to clarify that for people who
Yep.
don't know, there was an exemption here that this was only going to apply to, like, your big name record label people or your big name
Yes.
studio people, your average person with a podcast. This was not going to apply to, like,
This was
like
not going to
the podcast
apply.
right here would not apply to this. But then that exemption was removed for
Yes.
reasons unknown.
Yep.
And then they said, well, hey, we don't need that in there. I said, well, then just put it back in. They said, well, no, no,
Yeah.
we want to make sure we cover everything.
Yeah, precisely. And so, and this is what's happening. I think there's been another vote on this. Well, actually, they were moving to close debate.
Which is also strange, right? That's also a strange thing to happen, that you have something that people are complaining might stifle free speech on the internet. And so the government decides they want to stifle debate on the bill that might stifle free speech.
Something they said they would never do. But it's interesting. What's delicious about all of this is that the party that is most all in, so we're in a minority government situation where the Liberals do not hold the majority of seats to pass bills. They've been relying on a relationship of convenience with the NDP. But the folks who've been most interested suddenly in this have been the Bloc. So now we have the Liberals, who are considered the natural governing party of Canada, pro-Canada all the way, are now in bed to get their bill passed and basically have debate shut down in the committee. They're partnering with the Bloc Québécois, the separatist party.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the Bloc Québécois is a party who basically wants the province of Quebec to separate from Canada. And there was a referendum held many years ago, which they lost the referendum, so Quebec stayed in Canada. But they still advocate for Quebec sovereignty. So they are strangely enamored with this bill, which I can see on one hand, I can see on the other hand, it doesn't make sense. So on the one hand, the Bloc Québécois very much would like to see the promotion of Québécois content. So I can see why they would be in from that perspective. But at the same time, these broad powers that allow the government to suppress videos they don't like, well, if you're pushing for another referendum and you're suddenly saying, hey, maybe we want to leave this country, and you're giving the government that would want you to stay the power to just suppress any content that might speak out against it, that seems like you're shooting yourself in the foot there.
Well, completely. And I see it from a more nefarious perspective too, because there was a lawsuit that the government launched, in the last election, where they alleged against the Tory party because they were using what they alleged were fair use clips, news clips, in their advertising campaigns. They said that was inappropriate and basically violated a number of provisions of the Election Finance Act, and was not appropriate use of clips from the CBC or CTV. In fact, a lot of these organizations have had a long-standing grudge against any of their fair use, what you would consider fair use clips of the government, like the Prime Minister, putting his foot in his mouth, for example, and using that in an advertisement and saying, this is what he actually said in the House. You make your decision on if you want to support this guy anymore. Well, now through this bill, I see it as a backdoor. So the government lost that lawsuit against the Conservative Party. And to my mind, like if I was being particularly wicked and maybe conniving or Machiavellian, I would have said the lawsuit was to keep you distracted while I get the bill passed through Parliament. Because now if I can control like one or the other, these are great pieces. If I won the lawsuit, that's gravy. Now I've got some precedent to hold you down from ever criticizing me in the media. And especially, if you try to run TV ads. But we're in the internet age now. And wow, if I can actually get the CRTC to do this for me, that's even better.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the interesting things is the CRTC to have influence over companies like, let's say, YouTube, over what content gets recommended and what content gets promoted. it's kind of scary, right? That might happen. And it's all in the name of promoting Canadian content. But here's what I don't understand. And for those of you who are not Canadian, you probably don't know about this, but in Canada, in broadcast, we have Canadian content regulations. This is so that if you have a television station, you have a radio show, you must have a certain percentage of content that comes from Canada or from Canadians. So if you're listening to the radio, there'll be so many Canadian bands that are played per hour or whatever it is. And obviously the internet changes all that because there's no Canadian content regulations. So the drive behind this is kind of to how do we extend Canadian content regulations to the internet? Now, the funny thing about this, and this goes back to something I've talked with you about before, Chris, which is, we have to look at these old rules and regulations that we have for like 50, 100 years, hundreds of years. Some of these concepts, we've debated copyright law for many times. Yes. These are solutions that were made in a time in very different contexts. And it's like, you might still have a noble goal that you're trying to achieve, but maybe this isn't the way to do it anymore. And I don't see why it would ever make sense to try to apply Canadian content regulations to the internet. And I'll explain why. So when you have radio stations and you have television stations, there are only so many television broadcasters. There are only so many radio stations, which means anybody can't just start a radio station and play whatever songs they want. So with this scarcity of broadcast, then it's like, well, it's entirely possible that these stations may never play any Canadian content. And that would be bad. We might say that might be bad. And so we put regulation and say, well, if you're going to operate in Canada on our airwaves, you have to use this because that's a scarce resource. But there is no reason why a Canadian can't create a YouTube channel that can compete just as much with any American. It's the same level playing field. And it's not even hey, well, US, bigger audience, bigger whatever. It's like, hey, Justin Bieber got huge off YouTube when he was in Canada, if I remember correctly. I think he was still in Canada. So it's like, if you really wanted to invest in Canadian content, I could see why you might want to do that, why you might want to have Canadian programs. But wouldn't it make more sense to invest in making sure that, Canadians have access to maybe training on how to create content and put it out on the internet, or setting up studios that Canadians could go in and book and use, that's maybe subsidized in some way so to produce more Canadian content, right? But it seems kind of ridiculous to treat the internet as a scarce resource that has to be regulated to have X amount of Canadian content, when instead you could invest in Canadian content for it to succeed in other ways. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, I think you're headed in the right direction. I don't know if our entire attitude towards using public funds would be something like investing in, a section of the CBC down on Front Street, to allow just about anybody but I kind of find it kind of preposterous, because anybody with a phone can become a broadcaster. I mean, certainly that's where many of the original YouTube stars came from. But all this brings to mind something that's rather interesting. You just reminded me about in all of the presentations that the minister and, like, I think the deputy minister and I think some other ancillary characters on committee were making. I think it was the Conservatives who brought this up. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. But they brought up, well, you're saying that that there is a problem with Canadian content and Canadian content producers being able to be found, and that's your intent here. Why haven't you invited some of the Canadian superstars of YouTube and TikTok here to make presentations? And it was a glaring, this is what's coming across with this particular piece of legislation. Is it seems that neither the minister nor any of the brain trusts surrounding him were very well prepared to advance this. It's almost like they're arguing from the back foot. They might have had a point if this was, 15 or 20 years ago, but where we are at right now, it's completely redundant. We have, high enough internet speeds here where you could stream something live from the street if you wanted to. You could actually do that if you wanted. So I don't understand where this argument, I think, is a Trojan horse, that they wanted to have Canadian content discoverable and accessible. And it plays to a bit of a bigotry of low expectations of what a Canadian is able to do. I mean, like, I can't find my own content.
Well, and that's the thing too, and that goes back to what I originally said, is usually this is always set up with one or two premises, but it's never that, right? It's
Yeah.
always the Canadian content, or it's always the fight piracy, but it's never about that. Because
It's
if it
never.
was, you would make a very simple bill, around just that thing. But these are always very broad-ranging, regulating, and almost always, how do we suppress speech we don't want? How do we stifle innovation we don't want? Right?
Yes.
As opposed to actually the thing. And the thing is, and the reason why I mentioned they could do these programs is if your actual goal, and again, we can have the debate about whether Canada should have a goal of this from a government level or just leave it to people individually. But if you have a goal that you want Canadians producing culture and content that succeeds, in an internet age, okay. But as you pointed out, there are different ways you can invest in this. Yes, you could invest in, how do we help roll out high-speed internet to more rural areas where it's tough? That could be useful. Talk about discoverability. How do we, do we include something like that in classroom teaching on, how to creating content and, how to do things like SEO, right? Why isn't that part of our curriculum? Because we could do that, and we can, if this is our goal. Again, you can have the debate about whether that should be your goal or not. But if you decide it's not, that's our goal, there are so many other ways that would be more helpful and more useful. And instead, it's just, well, we have this existing thing, this Canadian content rules. Let's see if we can blow that up as much as possible and basically make a mess of everything. And then secretly, we'll then be able to push whatever content we want or suppress whatever content we want.
Yeah.
And again, and same thing, when it's always the copyright pushes, it's always, how do we help our buddy lobbyists make some extra money by, suing Canadians, which was, of course, some of the previous copyright legislation pushes that were attempted.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that on this particular topic, we overlap more than we disagree. But I see this for what it is, because this began to come into the public consciousness. It began to get promoted and trial ballooned right around the time of the U.S. election. And of course, they were wanting to look at, I don't know why, but we as Canadians, we have this I think we've got an endemic inferiority complex. If America is dealing with fake news, my God, we must be dealing with so much fake news. So the government here needs to be able to put a stop to fake news. And it's like, but you guys have been in charge for the past 8 years. Okay.
It's also weird that, the primary source of Canadian news is CBC, which is
the state
government.
broadcaster.
So if there's an epidemic of fake news in Canada, I'm not sure the government solves that problem, since that's where the majority of Canadians get their Canadian content. That seems a bit strange to me.
Precisely.
Yeah,
precisely.
a little bit bizarre. Speaking of fake news, there's our transition for us. So apparently there's this theory about a lab, and apparently things might leak out of that lab. And a couple weeks ago, had I said those words, we'd already be canceled. And maybe we will be still. I have no idea. Our stream may already be offline.
We're talking to dead air.
It could entirely. Well, at least StreamYard I know is recording it, so it'll at least be recorded. Let me double check here. Yeah, we are still streaming as far as I know. All right. So this is the problem of trying to have authoritative sources, of having fact checkers, of having experts that weigh in on things. Is, in an ideal world, yeah, obviously, you could have an objective fact checker who could check a fact, that could do the research on it, and you would end up with the fact. You could have experts who have experts in the field, and hopefully they would actually work with other experts in other fields, because these things are often connected, although we know that doesn't happen, to actually figure out what's going on. But it turns out people have agendas. People have different things going on. People have their own biases. And who fact checks the fact checkers? So we have the completely, totally debunked conspiracy theory that, and I won't say the name of it because I think YouTube still censors if we say the name of what's happening in the world right now, other than this thing that caused a pandemic. Could not have come out of a laboratory in a place in China. Again, I'm not sure what we're allowed to say here, but that was absolutely debunked by experts, all the experts. Fact checkers fact checked it and said that is confirmed. It is debunked. And the expert of all experts, Dr. Anthony Fauci, did not dispute it in any way, shape, or form. Even though, as we know now, perhaps there are some emails. And perhaps those emails might suggest he may have heard of some evidence, despite claiming no, there was no evidence. And again, that doesn't mean that this theory is true. I don't know if it's true. You don't know if it's true. Nobody knows right now if it's true. But the fact is they were so adamant that it wasn't true. And yet, now that it all comes together, we don't know how anyone believed it wasn't true. Like, nobody did the research. The fact checkers didn't actually check any facts. They didn't go to any studies. They didn't go to anything here. There was an open letter in the Lancet that was signed by a bunch of people who also happened to work in connection with the laboratory, by the way, who said they had no conflict of interest, but clearly it turns out they did. But even they didn't actually do the research to find out if it were true. And somehow we end up saying this thing is completely debunked, but nobody checked. So how does this happen, Chris? How does this happen?
Ask Covering 101. That's basically that's what I've been able to surmise out of reading everything, is that I saw a congressional hearing that Fauci was on with respect to, and this is from 2012, talking about funding gain of function research. And that's what this all revolves around is, we were told very quickly that the virus had to come either from bats or pangolins or ferrets. I mean, there was a number of theories that were actually advanced, but nothing was actually said about the NIH funding this particular lab in Wuhan to the tune of, south of $1 million. In terms of investment in a lab, that's not huge. You could probably blow that very quickly, but they were actually funding researchers. I mean, one of them was actually known as the Bat Lady because of the research that she did on the particular virus that came out of a cave in the region.
Just step back for a second here before we get into that. Because of course, if it did not have origins in some particular lab, then it must have happened naturally.
Exactly.
Now, one of the interesting things that had not come up was that previous viruses that had come out, I think MERS and SARS, that did occur naturally. Within about 3 months, I think for the SARS one, they were able to trace it back to, okay, here's the animal, here's the animal of origin type thing. And I think it was 9 months for MERS. I might have those mixed up. I'm not sure. Fact check me on that one, because I'm just remembering here. Don't believe anything I say. Who knows? I could be completely misremembering things. But again, within a fairly quick period of time, they were able to track down the ancestor to say, okay, this is probably where it starts to originate. And that has not happened yet here. In all this time, that has never happened. And yet everyone had such confidence that must have been how it was, even though there isn't really any evidence for that. Again, that doesn't mean it's not possible, but it just hasn't, we don't have that evidence yet.
Oh, yeah, completely. Well, there was industrial strength hand wavium that was applied to this, right? Do not look behind this particular curtain if you ask this question. And it was very interesting to see that very early on, both here in Canada and in the United States, or even here in Ontario, we had senior public officials going into Chinatowns, respective Chinatowns, to tell everyone, please keep going and buying Chinese food and Chinese products wherever you can. And it was it was
Pelosi in San Francisco. I think it was the Chinese New Year parade went down there.
Yep. Christine Elliott, Minister of Health here in Ontario, she was going through Chinatown here in Toronto. Same. It almost seemed to be coming from the same kind of playbook. And the idea was that very quickly this was going to be placed as a racist, xenophobic argument, right? If you begin to question the origins here, and everyone's saying, but it seems to have come from over there, and they're like, nope, racist, xenophobe. You've got to go back to school. You've got to learn. Maybe you should go meet some real Chinese people and comfort and console them. And it's like, but that's not the problem here. Like, And then it became, well, you can't call it the Wuhan flu, or you can't call it this, that, or the other thing. You can't identify where it even comes from, because now that became racist.
Right.
So
unlike the UK variant, the South African variant, and the Indian variant, and I think there was a Brazilian variant, and all the variants. Unlike those, which is not at all racist to call the UK variant the UK variant. However, this one is. Which again, and it seems also strange that it became so political, because whether you believe it came from a wet market or whether you believe it came out of a lab that was like 300 meters away from the wet market, I'm not sure how one is better than the other.
Yeah, and to be sure, like, that wet market argument had legs for a very, very long time because of its proximity to the lab. Mm-hmm. So, it was suggested, for example, that there was frozen samples or frozen meat, that had thawed at the wet market, and that's how this got communicated and got spread throughout. But it's kind of funny, though, because what we've since, I don't understand how we're only learning right now how airborne viruses work, but apparently we didn't know enough back then, a year ago. How exactly it was supposed to...
Well, the emails might say otherwise. Just saying. Read some emails.
That's right. It could be in the emails. In fact, it is definitely in the emails. But how it got off this particular, I think it was bear meat, I think they were suggesting, or some kind of meat, and that's how it got into the environs. But it's like, these wet markets are open. There's a lot of air circulation. And which, as
we know now, apparently doesn't do so well in the open air. And we didn't know at the time, but now we look back and we say, well, okay, it actually doesn't spread all that much in the open air. There haven't been, I think there was maybe one case of open air transmission, which, considering all the cases, is pretty low. So then it would be weird if it did originate there. But again, at the time, this is hindsight. So at the time, we didn't know that. So that's okay. I have no problem with that. You go with the information you got. And this is the weird thing about the emails, is there was conflicting information out at the same time. And again, it's not somebody, everyone wants to jump on that, well, Fauci lied, Fauci did this. And it's like, well, if you look at his statements, he doesn't necessarily directly lie, but he doesn't often reveal the complexity of the situation either to certain political expedients. Like, again, when everyone was going on saying that the lab leak hypothesis was a debunked conspiracy theory and PolitiFact fact-checked it as false, he had an email which said, hey, there is some evidence here. Again, this does not necessarily mean it's true, but there is something here that suggests maybe it might be. And he didn't come out and say, hey, you know what? Let's not rule that out. It may, maybe I don't think it's likely, because it's fine. He could have said, based on all the things I've seen, I don't think it's likely. But that's different than letting the media run with the narrative. This is a debunked conspiracy theory, when he knows it's not really debunked. Again, you can still think it's not likely.
Well, and this is why I say it's Ass Covering 101, because the 2012 congressional hearing that he was at, where he was being asked direct questions with respect to gain-of-function research, he was making it very plain that that's exactly what they were going to be doing. And he was saying that basically on the balance, I think the way that he phrased it is that it had to be on balance for the public good, that they would be doing these kinds of things. And this is interesting because that's happening in 2012. And he's been head of the NIH going through all of this period, directing and knowing where this investment would be going. And he's been saying the exact opposite thing in many, many interviews, or like, for example, under questioning from Rand Paul or others, asking him directly, did you direct funds for gain-of-function research? And he's denied. And I think right now he's getting to the precipice where it's beginning to get a little shaky and untenable to keep holding these positions, as Brett Weinstein says on the Dark Horse podcast. There is now a preponderance of and a mountain of evidence that strongly suggests that it is entirely possible and probable that the NIH did fund this kind of gain-of-function research, and we did have an accident that happened at this lab. So the open question in all of this is, did China engineer it deliberately as a bioweapon, or was this What was the whole reason for doing gain of function research in this particular virus?
And well, here's the thing: before we get completely canceled, because you just said that, and that's just instant canceling right there. Because again, my thing is hopefully we find out what is true at some point.
Yes.
But what really bothers me, and the thing that's really important to talk about at this, is how the media narrative is about this, right?
Yes.
Because people were floating the idea, and you mentioned Brett Weinstein. If anybody doesn't know Brett Weinstein stuff, absolutely check it out. He's done some great digging on this topic.
For a long time. Is,
a lot of the people who've been coming out talking about this, even everyone criticized Donald Trump for doing the debunk conspiracy theory, they would frame it as if he was saying it was a bioengineered weapon when he didn't actually say those things. Or people who were making the claim weren't saying those things. Like, there's a difference between saying it originated in this Wuhan Institute of Virology versus it was intentionally created to be leaked to cause harm, to cause a global pandemic. Like, that's a whole different claim that I don't see a lot of people making. I mean, I'm sure there are some fringe people who have made that claim. We're not making that claim. YouTube, just so you know, cancel us for other things, but not for that one. But the idea was, no, it may have come out there accidentally. Again, and they may have been doing it for the noble purpose of trying to figure out how to better fight off pandemics. And that still doesn't absolve them of responsibility. And we still need to be made aware about this. And so we need to be able to talk about these things. Exactly. And the fact that they spin the narrative to say we're claiming, people who are doing this are claiming something that they're not claiming so that it can be dismissed. Yes. So look at these crazy conspiracy theorists thinking that China's making bioweapons in this lab here to unleash. Well, no, that's not the claim. That's not really the claim. The claim is, could it have come from there? And the answer is yes, it could have come from there. And it could have come for many reasons. And only one of those reasons would be the bioweapon one. And again, I haven't seen any evidence that would suggest that they were actually trying to do something like that. So I would not make that claim. YouTube, you hear me? I'm not making that claim.
No, we don't have any evidence to support that. But it is very strange to be supporting. Like, this is the most dangerous kind of research that you can be doing. Mm-hmm. And this virus in particular, the way that they are looking at the sequencing of it, understanding how the spike protein actually works, this is something that is really quite volatile. It's a highly communicable disease because of the way that the virus actually works and coalesces with your cell. So the spike protein itself is something that I've just come to understand recently in the past couple of weeks. The protein itself is a pathogen. And that's what's causing some complications with the various varieties of vaccines, depending on how they are presenting the protein to the cell in order to program your defenses. If it injects that protein directly into the cell's nucleus, that's where it can begin to get misshapen and broken. And that's what's causing in different people different reactions. And it's much more suitable, like say, for example, in the Pfizer or other similar vaccines, where it's going just into the cell fluid and it's beginning to adapt that way. But what they found out is that we widely misunderstood that the protein, the spike protein itself, served no other purpose other than to anchor into air passageway cells, which is why it's a lung and respiratory disease. It's the primary infection. That's why they look for it in your nasal passageways. So when they found this out, now this is a really interesting development. Why would you be developing or trying to improve how this particular virus works? That's a very, very open question. I understand, like, you have to study viruses in order to defeat them and be able to get ahead of them and understand what are their evolutionary properties. But whenever we see this, generally speaking, and again, this has been my understanding in doing a little bit of reading and research over the past several months, is that every time a government or a lab invests itself in very complex, very sophisticated, but also very dangerous viral research, usually the researchers are the ones who end up as the first ones to go. And it always seems to escape. It's volatile. And that the Wuhan lab seems to be following the pattern. They're not the first. These things
Well,
have
one of the
happened
interesting
before.
things that's kind of come out was when told, well, the possibility that it could have come out of a lab, um, just the straight response of just like, well, yeah, it's happened before. It's like, what do you mean it's happened before? I think somebody said it happened like 6 times. It's like, why did no one tell us about this? Like, we
Yeah,
should have been made
I
aware
don't
of
think
that.
I don't think we want to know.
Well, again, so the reason we want to know is because there's a very interesting question, and I think it was 2017 as I had seen that Fauci had written something on doing gain of function research and said that even if there's a risk of a pandemic, that it's valuable to do this research. And it's like, well, that's an important conversation to have. And if you're telling me that we've had like 6 leaks, then we should probably be having that conversation to say, well, wait, is it really worth this trade-off?
Yeah.
Because I've seen Jurassic Park. And I'm not a scientific expert, but I'm pretty sure you don't mess with some of these things. What was the line in Jurassic Park? Is just because you can doesn't mean you should, or
Doesn't
something
mean
like
you
that.
should. Yeah,
Yeah,
Jeff
yeah,
Goldblum.
yeah. And again, I think if you take that conversation to the people, they might not react the same way that Dr. Fauci would have. And even though we're not experts, I think we should probably have a say in that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And of course, there's a weird tie-in as well, because we don't know if this is actually connected or not, but we've had 2 Chinese researchers who were working with a level 4 lab, I think in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, and they were dismissed for something. And this is a level 4 lab which deals with virology. And the circumstances under which they were dismissed, what happened, nobody's saying nothing and nobody's seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
that's been,
again, I don't know if it was confirmed because, again, it may still be, but it may have just been speculation I was reading. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But there was something about shipping of samples out to that particular lab.
Oh, yeah.
And,
That's right.
Then they were dismissed. And it's like, well, okay, so they weren't supposed to ship those samples to that lab? Well, then why were they shipping those samples to that lab? And again, not necessarily that it ends up connecting in any way, but if there's kind of shady stuff like this going on, what other shady stuff has been going on there? Again, a lot of questions that need answers.
Yep. And it would go a long way to have a good, clear explanation provided by someone who doesn't necessarily have a vested interest, right?
Of course.
But I think, to bring this back to your original point about how this has become a verboten, how quickly it was made a political and verboten topic, I think is one that bears some exploration. And I know Brett Weinstein's been on, in the vanguard on this, because he was one of the first ones out saying, a lab leak is a plausible hypothesis. Why are we shutting down an entire avenue of inquiry? That's not science. And this is what's astonishing, is that some folks, that you would expect would have much more open minds to this, suddenly circled the wagons. And I mean, like, we noticed that either professionally, we noticed it in the media, we noticed it, amongst, researchers, the 27 signatories in the Lancet, and some of whom had some conflicts of interest, as it turns out, and stood to benefit from keeping this under wraps. Just how quickly the wagons turned, and we were beginning to have spin given to us, as opposed to an understanding of, okay, well, let's talk about a hypothesis. And I think that's characterized the entire, if there's anything that 2020 is best characterized by, it's that this was the year when open inquiry died in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. And we became the poorer for it. And now we've got a lot of people who cringe at the, just the mere thought of a contrary opinion because of it. It's gone much bigger than just the lab leak. It's permeated into public discourse.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, and for people who are talking about this stuff, politicians are going to politician. Again, I'm not a huge fan of politicians or any political party, but I expect them to do that. But the state of the media has been absolutely disgusting. It's just, and I don't care, left or right, whatever, it doesn't matter. The things that we are told that are absolutely true, that are absolutely false, we later find out, is, I'm sure that's happened in the past too. I'm sure there's always been spin, but it's just so blatant, and it's like they don't even care anymore. So we get this, the fully debunked lab leak hypothesis when nobody actually checked. And it's like, but how did everyone start to repeat this talking point across all these news organizations? And then we get things like, everyone's still going on about what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, where we were told absolutely by multiple news sources that a Capitol police officer was beaten severely with a fire extinguisher and died as a result of his injuries. But that didn't happen. And that's weird. Like, how does that happen? Like, because it was very specific in the details. It wasn't just like, oh, an officer was killed or officers were injured and one died. It was very specific, a very specific imagery that was fashioned, that was repeated across multiple news networks, and people still believe it today. It's like, but now that never actually happened. How did that happen? Like, how does that story become a story and get spread across all the news organizations with absolutely no evidence in it? And not a single reporter checked.
Yeah.
Well, you can get a secondary source. Like, did you even have a first source? Like, or did you just copy somebody else's news reporting?
Well, and that's what's been discovered, right? Like, we found that, the New York Times, for example, has been taken as a paper of record on things that that everyone just hasn't bothered to put any critical fact checking into, and they repeat the exact same wording, as the New York Times reports, or with sources from, or reporting from the New York Times. And then you see it begin to cascade out, and then it becomes revealed, oops, the Times got this one completely wrong. I mean, there's a number of things going back over the past year where they have misattributed fault because it served a particular purpose for the editorial board. And that damages, like I think the Times is suffering from a real crisis of credibility because of that. And I think they're only second, I think, they would probably be number one. The Washington Post would probably be the second in terms of credibility. But I was watching, how does this actually happen? I think throughout history, we've got a lot of examples of completely factually incorrect things being run with and taking on a life of their own and not actually having any basis in fact. They just sound good. And there's a couple of angles on this. I was watching an old video by a fellow who goes by the name of Veritasium on YouTube, and he was talking about the principles of cognitive ease and cognitive strain. And he made an interesting point. He said if we repeat things often enough, they actually, even if they're completely false, they can be comforting to us to recall. They make us feel good to say them and recall them. And to actually challenge them requires cognitive strain, and that's unpleasant. And it takes effort to push through that. So those of us who are cursed with the affliction of being a skeptic, like I am, I just never accept anything on face value. I distrust authority instinctively, and I ask, why? How do you know? That causes a lot of cognitive strain. It's much easier to accept something. So in his video, he says, if I tell you, the body temperature of a chicken is 36 degrees Celsius, and if I say that over and over and over again, eventually you're just going to come to accept the body temperature of a chicken is 36 Celsius, and it's actually 41.
I would say here that it's a little bit different, though. So, like, when you get something like, let's say the Jussie Smollett thing, right?
Okay.
Now, here's a guy who actually came out with a claim. And you can say, okay, in this case, your theory applies. They were just uncritical. It sounded believable of something they would want to see happen. We don't need to dig into it. We'll just run with it. Turns out it didn't happen that way. Okay. In this particular case, there are specific details. Where did they come from?
Oh, yeah.
Right. This is the thing. Like, we know Jussie Smollett claimed these things and the newspaper uncritically ran with it. That's fine. Bad, but we get it, right? It was too good to be true. You ran with it. You didn't question. You got fooled. But this case, very specific details. Beaten to death with a fire extinguisher, which is a very visual, persuasive imagery for the events of the day. I mean, that was a kind of a rallying thing around that. Like, look at how horrible these people are. Look what they did. They beat a guy to death with a fire extinguisher. Somebody came up with that because it didn't happen.
We don't know who.
But we don't know who.
Yeah.
And we don't know where that is in the chain. There's just somebody decided, hey, that's a thing. And somebody just ran with it because somebody said, hey, this thing. They didn't to the best of our knowledge, they didn't produce any video evidence of it. They didn't produce anything. They didn't come forward. There's no name attached to this person who claimed it. Nobody followed up with secondary sources. And it's, again, they didn't run with it in the same way they did with Jesse Smollett, where guess what? They brought him on the air, told the story and all this stuff. You could have corroborated that with any number of people who were there if that thing happened.
Yep.
And yet we don't know. We don't know who came up with that story. But somebody did.
Yeah, the mind can wander and try to figure out. But like when we see some of the stories that have proven false, it's been the actual journalists themselves. So whoever was the journalist crafted this. With respect to the Capitol Hill riots, I mean, we have an instance where there was an informant that the FBI was involved with who was fingering some guy for instigating the riots or doing a provocation. And it turns out that they go and, this guy was just railroaded. The FBI accepted the word of a rather shady informant that they had been paying.
By the way. They
paid informant, yeah. And just ran with it. And all of a sudden, this poor guy finds his life turned upside down. Turns out he has nothing to do with it, and they quietly released him.
Well, the thing that's interesting about what you said there was about, coming from journalists is like, what's the really scary thing? The scary thing is, what if a journalist just made that up?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Because we don't know. We have no idea who the source is. We have no idea where it came from. I mean, they claim some source inside, I think, the police department, Capitol Police Department or something. But what if somebody just said, hey, it'd be a great story and, I want to have the clicks or whatever. So I'm just going to say that because they didn't check with it. Or again, even more innocently, they have an informant there who wants to give them something juicy. And, it's not nefarious, but just, hey, wouldn't this make a great story? And then it goes from there. I don't know. That's the frightening part to me is we don't know where this comes from. Like one of the other ones that kind of came up again comes up over and over again. And, I think enough people have beaten the fine people hoax to death. But I don't think enough people talk about the drinking bleach hoax.
That's a good one.
And it's because I knew that one right away, and that was what really kind of bothered me about that one. It's the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. When you know something about something and it happens and you see it, it really stands out. And then you have to check yourself because everything else is also following that same problem. But if I remember correctly from the actual question, Donald Trump never says the word bleach. It's the reporter that interjects that word.
Yes.
And then everyone puts those words in Donald Trump's mouth. And, as you know, during the pandemic, I've played around with some day trading stuff. And during the early days of the pandemic, guess what? There was a lot of biotech stocks that were taking off because of possible cures for COVID, treatments for COVID, other things like that. And one of these companies was a company that had this thing where I think it was called Healite, I think was the name of it.
Yep.
Where I think they would inject you with something, and then they put a tube down your throat, and it would shine UV light to basically disinfect things. Essentially, what Donald Trump was talking about, because I'm assuming someone briefed him on it, because again, I was familiar with the company because their stock went from like $3 to like $20 prior to this. So I'm thinking, oh man, this stock's really going to pump once they talk about this, because Trump talked about it. But then it gets spun in all kinds of weird directions. And again, nobody comes out and says, hey, no, this company actually exists. I mean, he didn't word it in the most elegant way, but he certainly didn't say drink bleach.
No.
It's certainly a real thing that was being investigated. I don't think it ever panned out to actually be an actual treatment.
Well, I can't recall. There's an NBA team that actually purchased. I don't know if it was their technology or an adjacent technology, very similar for their team. I mean, it's not unusual. Basketball teams will try just about anything to give their guys an edge, even if it is a little fringe. And they'll ask a couple of guys, "Hey, do you want to try this out?" But I do recall that being a point. Like this is not an unknown or untested therapy, and here's an NBA team that's actually using it.
Yeah, and this is a penny stock company, sketchy. They'll probably never actually bring this thing to market. But again, it's fine to talk about because it's a real company that's really invested in trying to do this. They have investors. There is papers behind this of what they're trying to do. They had a website and video demonstrating things that existed before all of these comments, right? They suddenly got thrown in the spotlight. And again, here's the fascinating thing that happens there. First, they twist it to say, while Donald Trump says drink bleach.
Drink bleach.
Which he did not say at all.
Yep.
But then people, myself included, start talking about, well, no, there's a company that does this. And they start sharing the video. And Twitter takes it down.
Yeah.
And their video gets taken down. And I think their website might have got taken down as well. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah.
But wait, what?
Yeah.
Like, what is happening here? Where we spin what was said into something that wasn't, report it as true as if it was. That hoax stays around still. Still, people think that Donald Trump told people to drink bleach, which he never did. And this company had their material taken down. Why?
Yep.
Like, again, it's a company. It's what they do. It's their business. And somehow we have the media and we have social media platforms deciding what the narrative is going to be, as opposed to actually figuring out like what's actually happening. And that's scary. I don't know. That scares me. That's why, again, like politicians don't really care about that stuff as much. But you got a media that can't be trusted for anything.
Oh no.
Whether you agree with them or not, it's like you see that and you're just like, wow.
What I think we're seeing, I think we're now becoming aware. I think this has always been. I don't think this is anything new for how journalism has worked. I think we're just more aware of it now than we've ever been. And it's because the news cycle is not 24 hours anymore. It's actually a lot quicker. It's probably 6 hours, maybe even less than that.
I mean, and then faster. It's pretty much
it's milliseconds at that point. So now we've got the ability to have all kinds of signal and noise going in opposite directions and in the same direction, moving in different currents. So it's shaping public opinion very, very rapidly, and it's making it hard for. This comes back to some psychology in individuals that the journalists may be taking advantage of. Short-term memory, pattern matching. So there's an exercise I used to do with folks about where I would show them a list of words, all things having to do with sleep, like, pillow, blanket, hot cocoa, things like that. And then but I didn't include the word sleep. And then I'd cover it up and I'd ask people to tell me what words they remembered, and they would remember words like sleep. And I'm like, but I didn't, here's the chart, no sleep. Our brains are programmed to fill in gaps. So it's not surprising. Like I think this has been known inside of media and journalism for a very, very long time, that people have poor memories and are susceptible to being suggested. And their brains will do the rest. And you'll be convinced that something took place that did not. And it's very disturbing. Even like I think it's great that you brought up the Fine People hoax, because that's kind of like the bookend effect. It's like you only saw this much of the frame, but suddenly when the frame was expanded, now that causes enormous cognitive dissonance and strain in somebody, and not too many people deal with it. Some of them get very angry with you, that you've actually shown this. So what we now see with big tech, media, journalists, all working in they seem to be working in concert, right? They've covered their tracks very well, but it seems to be working hand in glove. The same phrasing is used, the same tempo is used, the same video is used, so that you have the suggestibility that this is actually what happened is planted in your subconscious or in your conscious, and you now roll with it. You're now programmed. And people don't think critically about that. They're not armed with the ability to do that. But I think we saw the long tail of this goes back to when Dan Rather wrote the memo against Bush. So when we had Rathergate, I think that was the chink in the armor that was beginning to reveal what was going on behind the curtain that we were unaware of. Now we're
the DUI one. Is that the one?
Yeah, I think like basically, it was a falsified. Yeah, it was
right.
It was a fake memo saying that he had gone out on a bender, and which plays because if you, at the time and in the context, stories about Bush's past when he was a young rapscallion came up, and then people just filled in the blanks, right? None of that actually happened, but it seemed plausible. So they just plugged it into their memory and away they went.
I think there's a difference too. I think a lot in the past, I mean, there's always a certain amount of just laziness, right? Mm-hmm. If we can make the story fit, then we'll make it fit, even if it's not perfect, right? Because it's close enough. Whereas now it seems more, and even with bias in media, let's say, media people have always had some sort of bias, and it will the story will be told from that perspective. But I think what we're seeing more of now is trying to reinforce specific ideas and talking points, and being so partisan that it's like it's not just, oh, I'm lazy and this makes my story, or wouldn't it be good if this were true? It's how can we make this say what we want? And that's, I don't know, that to me is really kind of where we're at. And it's not a great place, because now how do we even know what's real in the world? Like, I don't know. You know, who do you trust? Like, you know, all the stuff we know, even the stuff that we talked about today, based on what was real today, maybe all that's fake. We have no idea. Maybe more stuff will come out. So it becomes really hard. So not only do you get the Scott Adams 2 movies on the same screen, and completely separate realities that people can live in, but all of those realities might be completely wrong. And because nobody's even trying to get at the truth, then, you know, that can end up being a recipe for disaster. I mean, for example, if it turns out that this came out of some lab due to some gain of function research, and it was never uncovered, and it was always just assumed to be natural, and everything just went on as normal, you could just have another one of these just in a few months.
Yeah.
Because they're just business as usual there. And they don't fix up, you know, the protocols on, you know, how it ends up happening. And they do more and more of the stuff, and it gets worse and worse. And then suddenly we're in this situation again, but worse. And it's all because nobody actually dug to try to figure out, wait, what actually happened? How do we actually solve for reality? And it's like, well, I don't know. You know, my parents watch, well, specifically my dad watches CNN all day. And it's like, there is so much that's going on that he is not aware of because it's never talked about. And so many things that he's told about that we know aren't true. And they're never corrected. And it's like, you know, he still probably believes the drinking bleach hoax and the fine people hoax. And it's like, that's his reality. And the fact is, you know, you can go about your day and it's not going to affect you, knowing that that's not real. But again, you know, you also have the FBI and the White House saying that white supremacist terrorism is the greatest threat to the United States. Is that true? I don't know.
Well, if you redefine what that is, then maybe so. I mean, like, so you know, it takes on all kinds of color and character at that point, right? Because if you want it to be true, then how, you know, then the conspiracy theorist mind says, well, they're working on 2 sides of the argument, right? They're telling you it's a threat. Meanwhile, they're making sure that any measure that you can use to objectively determine what is a threat is now being moved into a slot where, oh, well, I guess so. You know, so for example, you know, the top bureaucrat at the Ontario legislature, you know, just recently admitted, yes, you know, the entire public service here is inherently structurally racist, not realizing the full gravity of what he just said.
Well, wait, is that true? Because if it is, man, we got a really big problem.
We got a really big problem. Not the least of which, he's paid $500,000 a year. He's the top guy, and he's been presiding over this presumably for years. Like, he's
at the same time, like, fire everybody. Like, if that's true, fire everybody. Like, why would you keep anyone employed at that point? Because again, that's also how you play it. Like, how when you define it, like, how bad is this thing? Because when I think about, you know, okay, we have a white supremacist structure, I'm thinking like KKK marching in the streets, burning crosses. Like, that's really bad stuff. And if that's our Ontario public service, again, okay, we got a clean house there. Like, that's a problem. But I suspect that's not actually what they're saying.
No. And that's what I mean.
Again, the realities shift. Like, what is the reality of this? So then is it the greatest threat? Like, well, again, if there's another gain of function research going on somewhere else in the world, is that not a significant threat? Like, I don't know. How does that label against white supremacy? How does China politically in the world, or Russia? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Like, all these competitors in the world, that's the one that's the biggest one. I don't know. I'd be curious to see how they come to that decision and what falls into that category, right? Because again, like you said, if the Ontario Public Service is a white supremacist organization, which they seem to have admitted that they are, I don't know how any of them still have jobs.
Yeah, well, it's got to start from the top down. I mean, there's collective agreements. There's two sets of collective agreements that are now going to have to be looked at. Did the collective bargaining process involve structural racism? So it's going to open.
No, you're asking the wrong question. It's not that structural racism occur here. It's how did it manifest itself this time? Am I getting it right?
That would probably be that would be better wording. Yeah, that's right. Probably what they would say. Yeah. So
again, different realities, right? If you believe that's true, if you believe that racism is happening every second of every day, all the time, everywhere, and it's just how is it manifesting? That's one way to look at the world. I don't know. Maybe it's right. I have no idea. But it doesn't seem to quite match up to the reality of the world that I've seen. But again, I could be wrong. I have no idea.
Yeah. It could be another. We could actually be having this conversation in multiple universes at the same time. So.
I suppose that's a possibility as well. All right. I think we've gone on long enough here tonight. If you enjoyed watching us talk here, we might do it again. I assume we'll probably do it again, have some different topics. If you have some topics you would like us to discuss, by all means, leave them in a comment below. Like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, all the usual YouTube stuff that gets us promoted in the algorithm. And anything else? Anything you want to talk about or plug before we wrap up?
No, I think that this has been a lot of fun for episode number 1. This is, I think we're starting off on the right foot. Hopefully we'll get canceled next time.
Well, hey, we might have already been canceled and we don't even know. And hey, in multiple different universes, we may already have.
That's true. We could be out.
All right. Thank you very much for joining me, Chris. And we will all talk again soon.
Thanks, Todd.